we're going to go ahead and get started. We're very pleased to have you here today. My name is Helen Aldred, and I'm the Director of Recruitment at Hawai'i Permanente Medical Group. Some of the recruiters are going to be joining me. We started a statewide provider recruiter group that encompasses Queens and HPH and the state hospital system, et cetera. And we have lots of recruiters that work together to try to recruit providers to the state. So they'll be in a little bit later. It's a little crazy out in the lobby right now. So they're talking to people. But when they come in, I'd like to introduce them so that you can see all the different options that there are here in Hawaii. Okay. So just to let you know, right now I'm at Kaiser, but I have worked at Kapiolani, Kuakini, Queens, and Straub. So I have a pretty good idea what the landscape is here. I've enjoyed working at each and every place, and I hope to bring the experience that I had to our presentation today. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how to write a CV. One of the things that people really don't think about when they write a CV is to start out and figure out what your personal, professional, and economic goals are. I'm going to give you a format for a CV that you can use, but most people, when they sit down and write a CV, they'll go online and get a format and start writing. But the truth is, before you do your CV, you need to define who you are, what you want, both for yourself, your family, and for the economics. And I'm going to go through a little bit later on how to make that assessment. So your cover letter and CV should reinforce your personal and your professional objectives. And if they don't, and I've seen this happen over and over again, if they don't, you'll end up in an opportunity that doesn't suit you. And it's so hard when you're in training. There's so much to learn clinically. There's so much to learn to be a professional, to practice when you come out, that some of these things, you don't have time to think about them. But when you go to look for a job, you have to think about them. Most physicians, when they come out of training, in 3 years, they'll decide whether that job that they took is good for them or not. You know, you always hear about the 7-year itch in marriage. Well, it's the 3-year itch when you come out of training and go to look for a job. And I've talked to residents that they're like, you know, I really didn't know what I was looking for. I really didn't think about what might be right for me. So taking that opportunity makes a huge difference. If you wait too long, then it's kind of like, oh, I got to get a job. And then sometimes you can walk into something that's not a good fit for you. So to do a cover letter, personalize it. Always use the name and address of the employer. Put one sentence in there as to how you learned about the job, and highlight your talents and expertise. Just a brief paragraph to let people know what you think your key talents are. Put your professional goals in there and the reasons that you're interested in the location. If you have any big time gaps in your resume or in your CV, you could put a couple of sentences in there as to, so nobody's asking themselves a question when they look at your resume. And at the end, put a call to action in there, which would be to telling them I'd be pleased to meet with you, I'd be pleased to talk with you about this opportunity. One thing I highly, highly recommend, recruiters are super busy, don't make it more than one page, because nobody will read it. And just so that you know, what recruiters use the cover letter for, there's several things, but one of them is to really, that's the first time we look at somebody to see what they really want without them knowing anything about the job. So we kind of consider the cover letter the real you. So it is important that you put in there, after you've done your self-assessment, what you're looking for, because we're going to look at that and say, okay, this is a good match or it's not a good match. The other thing is make sure that the spelling and punctuation is good, because one of the things that we're always looking at for a provider, excuse me, is attention to detail and making sure that things are done correctly. So if you have a lot of spelling errors or grammar errors, it speaks very loudly right out of the gate and you'll probably get screened out. Okay, when you're doing your CV, we have seen some of the most amazing CVs that you pick it up and I've seen recruiters just throw it aside because it's so busy and so disorganized. So when you're making your CV or your resume, make sure that it's visually appealing, that when it comes up, that the recruiter's going to look at it and you're going to get an impression right out of the bat. This is an organized person with good logical thought processes. So make it visually appealing, easy to scan, logically assembled, one-sided, And the timeline, this is really important, particularly if you get on in your career. The timeline with the progression of every single thing you've done should be apparent in 30 seconds or less. That's a tall order, but I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you a format, and you'll look at that and see how that actually can be done. We have had some CVs come in that we have actually had to take a piece of paper and start back 2005, 2006, 2007, and actually try and figure out what the progression of this person's career is. And it's really time consuming, and unless there's something on there that's really outstanding, most recruiters won't do it. So the chronological CV is really important. You should have 2 CVs. One with an updated comprehensive version that's got everything about you. I usually consider this kind of the academic version. So any papers or research or anything that you've done would be in the kind of long version. And then a 2 or 3 version with category summaries that you can just send off. If somebody says, I'm interested in this job, and they say, send me your CV, you'd want to go ahead and send them a shortened version unless you're looking for an academic position. And that's a very different kind of a CV. Today, I'm pretty much covering just the general areas. This is really specific, and it sounds a little bit crazy, but we recruiters are so busy that the easier you can make this on us, the better and probably the faster your basic talents are going to be reviewed. So make it easy on the eyes. Font, you can use Times New Roman or Garamond. The font should be 11 or 12, excluding the headers, and use space to separate each item because the heading should really stand out. And here's something that's really important. A lot of times now your CV is going to go into an applicant tracking system. We use a lot of automation. There's no really good automation for CVs. They don't parse them correctly. So basically, one of the things that you really want to make sure is you have about 8 to 10 words in that CV or resume that are relevant to the job. So if we search, you're going to come up. So when you look at whatever was in the advertisement or what is actually entailed in the job, make sure that you have at least 8 to 10 words in your CV that is going to come up. So what that means is that before you send a CV into a job, look at the job because they're all different. So you may want to change it a little bit based on the job that you're applying for. Make sure that the formatting is consistent. Check for spelling, typos, and bad grammar. And here's something that most people don't think about, but I think is incredibly important. Have the proofreading done by somebody who's not familiar with your career history. Because if they sit there and look at that and it doesn't make sense to them, or it doesn't look logical or easy, when the recruiter gets it, they're going to have the same impression. So I'm going to ask the folks here to go ahead and give out a sample of it's one of the CVs that most recruiters like. You can take a look at that and use it. The CV should always have complete and current contact information on it. A lot of people like to put an objective on the CV, what am I looking for, etc. If you have a cover letter, I wouldn't put the objective on there. It just takes up space and looks redundant. And again, if you're going to be applying for different jobs, which most people do, you need to make sure that all of your pieces match together. So if you're just sending a CV and you're not sending a cover letter, I would go ahead and put an objective up there, just a summary of what you're looking for. Education first, the recent first and go back to undergrad. Licensing and certification. This is really important. If you're board eligible, if you're coming out of training, include the date of your expected board exam. There's a huge difference amongst the specialties when people are actually eligible for boards. So it's a really good idea to just go ahead, if you know it, to go ahead and put it in there. The professional experience, the most recent first, the job titles and the employers, and make sure it's really concise. It really is a summary. So you would include, and this is on the format that I gave out, your professional societies and memberships, honors, awards, accomplishments, research, and publication. If you have any second language skills, that's really important to put on there. Now, personal interest is optional. There are some people that look at personal interest and, it may rule you out. So I'll leave that up to you as to whether, that's something that you want to put in. If the chief of the department happens to be a surfer and they say you're a surfer, maybe that might resonate with them. But sometimes, and we see this, we have folks that apply from the mainland, for example, who their key interests are reading, opera, some other esoteric thing that, no outdoors activities and a lot of things that aren't found here. somebody can look at that and say, gee, I wonder if that person's really happy here. So it can work in your favor, but it can actually work against you. So if putting your personal interests in there you think might support the job that you're applying for, I'd put it in there. Otherwise, I'm not so sure I would, because you just never know how people are going to interpret that. Okay, here's the do nots. This is very important. Don't put your birth date on there. Don't put your age on there. That actually could be, people try very hard not to discriminate these days, but don't put your birth date and age. Honest to gosh, there's still people who put their birth date on there, what their age is. Don't put your race on your CV. Don't put your sexual orientation on your CV, your marital status, how many children you have. And unless you're a model, don't put your physical characteristics on there either. Don't put your social security number on there, your licensure numbers, and I have seen some pretty strange email addresses as well. So before you go ahead and put your email address on your CV, I would make sure that it's not, sexybeast@gmail.com or something like that. Because I've been meaning to keep a list of some of the really weird email addresses that I've had. I get a good laugh out of them, but since this is a professional document, it's better to be a little bit careful about that. I liked one that was like echonerd@gmail.com for a cardiologist. That was kind of interesting. But do make sure that you have. Most people just set up a separate account for their job search, a Gmail account with their name on it. Pictures. Again, unless you're a physician or a provider model, you shouldn't put your pictures on your CV as well. And we've seen some where people put like a huge picture and a little bit of text. That makes you suspicious as soon as you look at it. But there's no reason to put your picture on there. And in fact, some people, it could work against you. Some people you might get screened out. People try very hard again, and there's laws against being discriminated. But if you might be young and look old, it's just not something that's necessary. So I don't recommend that you put it on there. I am really surprised sometimes what people will put on their CV. Okay, so the sample CV that I gave out, we have some over here if you just come in and didn't get a copy. This is one that's just really easy to use. We are going to be using an applicant tracking system soon, and we're really hoping that people's CVs will be in a format that will fit into our applicant tracking system. So the better yours is, the more organized it is. We've gone through all of the elements. But this is something that would make it a little bit easier going forward. And again, emphasizing, make sure the keywords, you have 8 to 10 keywords in that CV that match the job so that you don't get screened out. Okay, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about interviews. So is there any questions that anybody has about writing a resume or a CV or anything they'd like to share? Any questions? Yes. I would. If you did some work in undergrad, maybe some teaching or charity work or something like that that's relevant to medicine, I would put those on there because it's interesting. People do look at those things. It's interesting when you're applying for a job. One of the things that you'll see, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit in the interviewing. There's a big generational difference between the folks that are coming out of training and the people that are reviewing your CVs for hire. And so sometimes they think about things a little bit differently, but that is one area that people still look for. Well, what did they do when they were, before they were a doctor or while they were becoming a doctor? So if you have things like that you did during your training period, I put them in there because that is relevant. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay, the interview. I'm going to talk about something that you don't usually hear about when people talk about interviews. And it gets back to what I was saying about before you write your CV or before you set up your resume, you really need to know what you're all about. You really need to do some soul searching. When I was at Queens, I had some folks that would come up to me and say, oh, I really want to be a hospitalist. I'd love to be a hospitalist. I really like being in the hospital. And then as we started to talk and I would ask them, well, what kind of a day do you like? What are the things that are important to you in your practice? people would say things like, well, I really liked having control over my schedule, or I really like to be able to set my day and set my priorities. Well, if you're a hospitalist, you have no control over your day and no control over your priorities. But when you were training, maybe hospital medicine was the thing that drew you to that field, was the clinical side of it. You don't usually think about the rest of it. What kind of person am I? What are the things that I want to have in my everyday experience? And so you're busy coming out of training, so actually even thinking about, what do I want, really takes some kind of a conscious effort. But again, since the 3-year itch is the time when most people come out, take a job, and find out maybe that's not really what they want, a lot of them have said, I just didn't know what I wanted. I didn't even think about what I wanted. So there's nothing more frustrating than spending your precious time off to pursue a practice option that seems completely irrelevant to your goals and your needs. And the only way you can ever figure that out is if you sit down in advance and figure out what it is you're looking for and what's important to you. So how do you do that? A professional self-assessment, a personal self-assessment, and an economic self-assessment. Training is expensive, and people that come out of training now have up to $200,000 or more in debt. So when you go to take a position, the money hopefully doesn't drive you as the top point, but it's certainly something that you need to take into consideration. So you really do need to look into that. So I have another handout I'm going to give out that is going to talk a little bit about how you do those things to make it a little bit easier. What are the things that you think about in a personal self-assessment? So one of the things that we highly recommend that you do is to sit down and figure out what your goals are. What do you want to do? Back in the day when you came out as a provider, you had one choice: hang up a shingle and go into private practice. Maybe a couple of friends would join you, but that's it. Now providers have an amazing array of choices, and they have a lot of variation among them. So you really need to know what your goals are, what do you want your career life to look at. And the best thing to do is to sit down and create the characteristics of your ideal job, and then compare it to the characteristics of your nightmare job. And in that handout, number 12 on the first page will give you an idea of what kinds of things that you might look at. The location, whether it's a partnership track, what are the common patient care activities. Here's a big one, and that's pace. How many patients are you going to see a day? What's the pace in this office? What's the expectation? Some dermatology practices have 5-minute appointments. That makes me tired just thinking about it, but you really have to ask a lot of questions and know yourself to figure out if this is going to work. How much do you interact with other people? Collaboration is one of the highest values of doctors coming out of training, and we hear this every day. When you look at, what's the most important thing to you? Interaction and being in a collaborative practice is really a big thing. And when you're coming out of a training program, it's really a big thing, because if you don't have somebody to bounce ideas off of, how does this work? In some practices, you don't get that. Some of it's just the physical layout. Some of it's just the group isn't set up with that. And we know from interviewing so many people that collaboration and that ability to interact is really big. So you need to assess that when you go to look for a job. What's the staff management responsibilities? How many hours are you going to be expected to work a week? Are you going to need to take stuff home? Back in the day, you couldn't take anything home. Well, I do know some doctors that used to have trunks full of medical records, but that wasn't their preference. But now, with electronic medical records, you can work from home. So jobs can, your position can ooze well into your personal life as well. So you really need to think about, what is it that I want? What kind of technology does this organization have? How much do they pay? Do I want to teach? Do I want to do research? How much CME are they going to provide? Can I advance? Do I have to do other things besides take care of patients? How secure is this role financially? And what is the reputation of this group? So I'm not going to read all of this, but it gives you some things to think about. What would your best job look like, your ideal job, and what would be an absolute nightmare? One of the questions, and this sometimes I don't always get this answer because it kind of stops people cold sometimes, but one of the things that I ask every candidate is this: what is the one single thing that you have to have in your practice for you to have a successful work life? And you would be amazed at how many people can't answer that. That's usually the long silence thing where I get 10 gulps of coffee while we're waiting for an answer. But it's a very important question. And from there, you can figure out the rest of the aspects of the practice that are important to you, too. But what is the one single thing? And I'll tell you, for folks that have been answering that over the last probably 2 or 3 years, one of the highest values really is collaboration with collegial colleagues. It's really, really highly valued. I'd like to introduce Kathleen Souza, who snuck in. There'll be some other folks joining us, too. Kathleen does the recruiting, and I don't know what your exact title is, Kathleen. At Polymomy, so she's part of our physicians group, so I'm glad you could join us. So jump in anytime. So once you have a pretty good idea of your assessments and the things that are important to you, community and lifestyle issues are really a big deal. And the research has shown for most physicians, that's about actually 80% of the decision. I know nobody likes to think about that after going through training for 14 years, that actually it's the community, but it is. The community is really a big thing. So when you're looking at a job and when you're interviewing for a job, you need to make sure you get a really good look at the community if it's a community that you're not familiar with. Partners' career needs, huge. It's really interesting in the subspecialty areas, medical subspecialty and surgical subspecialty areas. We have so many physicians that come in that say my partner, whether it's husband, wife, or partner, is going to have 80% of my decision because they followed them around from one place to the other during their training period, and it's like it's their time now. So they are going to get a big input into the decision. So that's something that you really need to think about when you go to look at an opportunity. Is there going to be some place for my partner to work? That is our biggest problem as recruiters on the neighbor islands. So recruiting is challenging because the physician and provider pool gets narrower and narrower and narrower. But the truth is, when you go to the neighbor islands, it's even harder. So when somebody says, oh, yes, my spouse or my partner works from home on a computer, we're like, yes, because we know that they're going to be able to be happy and afford their career. But if it's something that we know is not present, it's really challenging. But you need to be really clear on that because wherever you go, if your partner's not happy, you're not going to be happy either. And it's something that some people just don't think about unless they've already sort of delegated 80% of the decision to that person. It's big. Family needs the same thing. What do your children need? We've had some candidates that wanted to be on Maui or on the Big Island, but they've had children with some extra special needs that are not there, and they were unable to move to that location. We have to be careful what we ask people about their families and children, etc. So it's something that we really like when the candidates bring that up. And you need to be very wise to whatever it is that your family and your kids need. So that's important. And your financial needs, including the compensation and benefits. And I'm going to talk a little bit about when to bring that up in an interview in a few minutes. But it's something you really need to be aware of. I interviewed somebody about a month ago, honest to goodness, who has been out of training and practicing for 15 years. And up until 2 years ago, he said he really never knew what his debt was from school. So now here he is, pretty far into his career, and he's still got $240,000 worth of debt. So he has some very high degree of specificity as to what kind of a job he can accept based on how much he can make. And you really don't want to find yourself in that position because it's important, but it doesn't want to, you don't want that to drive where you're going to be. So it's really important when you get out of training, hook up with a financial planner or whatever to just see what you're dealing with, because sometimes it can be quite surprising. Okay, so once you've assessed and you know what's important to you and what you want to do, then you really need to make this very, very important list. The first one is the must-haves, and as I was referring, what's the single thing that most thing that you want in your workplace that you have to be happy and successful? There should be, hopefully, there's more than one, but your must-haves, and then the negotiable factors. What can you negotiate? What? Yeah, it'd be good if I had it. Nah, I can deal without it. And then, and this is very, very important, what's unacceptable? What could you not accept in a workplace or a personal situation? You really, really need to be clear. Because when you go off on the site visit, you're going to be inundated with sensory data. So you need to be really clear what you're looking for. When you're talking with people, you need to be really clear about what you're looking for. And you need to be very aware of looking for things that you don't want. So the top 5 reasons that physicians leave their practices: poor cultural fit with the practice or the community, 50%. That's really high, and it's certainly one of those pieces of information that really supports that you do a personal assessment and know what you want. The people that want to be close to their families, they're left their families. Some people are happy to leave their families, but that's usually a big factor for people. And some people just don't think about it. And then, after a while, it's like, wow, I don't get to see my family. Reimbursement issues if you're going into a private practice or if you're going to accept a position where you're going to get a percentage of the reimbursement. Here's another one. It's really hard to figure out, and you really need to assess this when you're interviewing. One of the top 5 reasons that physicians leave their practices is because their administrative issues interfere with their clinical decisions. That's killer. That's something that'll drive somebody running and screaming from a practice, is interference in clinical decisions. It's very hard nowadays because you have to deal with insurance companies already and interacting with them with your treatment plan, et cetera. So if you have administrative policies in the group that are interfering, or you perceive them interfering with care, it's not a position you're going to stay in. Work-life balance is huge. Most of the folks coming out of training, and we see people that have taken jobs that they've just burned out really quickly. So you'll never know this unless you ask specific questions. And these are not questions that you ask the people that are interviewing you. When you go for an interview, you really want to hang out with some of your peers and talk to them. Well, what's it like? What's your patient load? When do you go home at night? Do you know what's the call, or whatever is pertinent to your particular practice? Yes, you're going to ask that as a question with the people that are interviewing with you, but you also want to make sure that you talk with your peers and find out what they think. Put chemistry really high on your list for cultural fit. This is what I call the gut. I think it's one of the most important things about figuring out whether a job is right for you. One of the things that we do at Kaiser is when we bring somebody in for an interview, we have them round, what we call rounding, for 2 or 3 hours during the interview, where they hang out in the department where they're going to work. I would recommend, if you do go for an interview and somebody doesn't offer you that opportunity, I would ask for it. Because there's nothing better than getting out into the environment and seeing how things work. I can talk till the cows come home. Kathleen can talk till the cows come home. We're going to be honest, but there's just nothing like getting out in that environment and then see what your gut tells you. See if it feels right to you. Does this look like a good opportunity? What we do here is, and we've had some people say, how do you do that? Well, what we do is that there's 2 pieces of information people have to sign off on before we let them in the patient care environment. They need to read some HIPAA information and sign off for confidentiality, because they are going to have access to patient information, and we have them have to show us a negative TB test as well. So, but with those 2 things, and the confidentiality and the TB taken care of, they will come and they will follow a peer around in the department or the chief around in the department for 2 to 3 hours. And you can see how the nursing staff works, how the MAs work, how the nurses work. You can learn more in that 2 hours than you would ever learn in any interview, because we've already talked about doing a personal assessment. You know what you want, you know what you don't want. Hanging out in a department for 2 hours will give you a very good picture of whether that's the right place for you. And I think it's the most important part of the interview. A lot of places don't do it, so you may have to ask for it. Yes. There's some variation on that based on whether it's specialty or primary care, but our doctors pretty well stay for a long time. We don't really have a lot of turnover. Kathleen, I don't know what you experience where you are. We will have some people that will come and just say, this is not, this is just not for me. But our interview process is so lengthy. We figure our goal as recruiters is to give the candidate as much information as they possibly can so that they can make their best decision. I would say most of our turnover is in the neighbor islands, and most of our turnover is based on the fact that the partner or spouse didn't like it here. What would you say, Kathleen? Yeah, and we hear that. Like I said, we have the statewide recruiters group. We all work together, and I think probably everybody would say that. So that's why it's so important to get your family involved in this as well. But I would say that's the number one reason for turnover is the individual liked it, but either the family did. Occasionally we'll have kids that don't like it. Those are usually teenagers. Most of the kids, if you get them anywhere near the ocean, they're very, very happy. But we do occasionally have some teenagers that come that won't be happy too, but it's mostly the spouse or partner. Okay, here's another big thing that we've discovered, surprisingly to me, that people don't think about. If you have pictures on the internet that are not flattering, and I don't mean that they make you look good, you need to get rid of them. Make sure your social media accounts are highly restricted and avoid placing information on the internet. It's really surprising to me how many people don't do this, because I'm obviously from a different generation. And what we've learned over time as we've been working with people is that this is such an ordinary part of life now. We communicate so much through social media. The boundaries have changed. And so people don't even think about going in there and cleaning it up. And, employers are not supposed to Google you. They do. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, and I'm sure Kathleen can as well, of some of the things that I've turned up that way. I can think of the physician assistant who went out with his surgeon supervising physician, and they all had a little bit too much to drink, and one of them spit in the cab, and one of them punched out the cab driver, and we didn't hire that person. But that's an extreme example. But the truth is there are things, if you really, that are inappropriate. I've seen that sexy beast on things other than the email, too, and some pictures that people just forgot to do anything about. So I really highly recommend that you clean that up. Yeah, no, you're right. There's probably no way, if you have a lot of stuff on there, there's probably no way that you could guarantee that you get rid of all of it. It's better off if you're a little bit more cautious before you put it on there in the first place. But you're right, there's probably no way that you could actually get rid of all of it. The other thing, too, is that when you're doing your cover letter, you're doing your CV, you're doing your phone interview, which we're going to talk about, we talk about red flags. If people find things that they think are a little disconcerting or aren't quite right, some of them will dig a little bit more on the internet. But if you have a nice clean CV and you've got a nice clean cover letter and you interact well in the interviews, people are still going to look. But I know Kathleen feels. But if you have some of those red flags, you feel the need to get as much information as possible, and you might dig a little bit more. Yeah. Be prepared to explain any of those things. So if somebody does come up with something that's unusual, make sure that you do have the opportunity to explain that. Okay, there's 3 types of interviews: the phone interview, the video interview, and the site visit. For physician recruiting, a typical process through the pre-hire process is usually 2 site visits, phone interview and 2 site visits. However, here in Hawaii, we use the first site visit as a video interview. It's very expensive to bring people out here. And in my office at Kaiser, between all the recruiters, we probably have 75 years of experience as recruiters, but we still don't know when somebody's actually coming out here for a nice 4-day weekend in Hawaii. So we like to do quite a screening process before we get to the site visit. But many organizations now are using video as the first site visit. So there's the phone interview that's screening, the video interview is just with the candidate, and then the site visit should be the candidate and their family. So, phone interviews, pre-schedule a time that's convenient for you. This phone interview, I cannot emphasize how important it is. This is your opportunity. You'll either get screened out through this or you won't. And so, we talk about site visits and how you present and how you dress and all of that. But the truth is, if you don't make it through the phone interview, you don't even have an opportunity to go face-to-face in an interview process. So pre-schedule a time that's convenient for you when you have no distractions. It's not a good idea to do when you're on call. It's not a good idea. And one of the things I'm going to talk about in a minute is that you can't see that person. So your tone of voice is huge as to how you come across. So if you really don't feel the enthusiasm, you really need to psych yourself up before you do a phone interview. And post-call is usually not a good time. Make sure you set aside adequate time. And if something happens, and it does happen, and we recruiters are used to that, you get patients, you get called, whatever, request to reschedule rather than tough it out. We'd rather reschedule than have you be in a position where you got to do a 5-minute interview or your dog is barking and your kids are crying or, whatever. You really need to make this an unrestricted time because we all have barking dogs. We all have kids. We understand that. But when we've set aside, 30 minutes to do this, we would like to feel that you have the respect to do the same thing. And use a phone line with a good connection. Gosh, there's nothing worse than being in the middle of a phone interview and the person disappears. This, as I said, this could make or break you, whether you're going to get an opportunity to present yourself on site. Prepare a list of questions, check out the practice in the community, get a name of the key decision makers if that's appropriate. Always communicate honestly. And this is really big. We can't see your face, so you really need to be enthusiastic and sincere. And be very, very aware of the tone of your voice, because all you're getting, that's the only sensory input that the recruiter is getting is what you're saying and how you're saying it. So it's really important. We have that same problem, too. I did an interview when I was working from home one time, and the weed whackers came around and the dogs started barking. I was glad I wasn't Skyping because I was doing that interview in the bathroom. It was the only way I could actually talk to the candidate. I wasn't very well prepared for that one. I didn't expect it. But it really is important that you give this some thought to make sure that you're prepared, because this is it. Because at the end of the phone interview, the recruiter's deciding, do we go or do we not go? You're doing the same thing. Okay, what kind of stuff are we going to ask you on the phone? Well, we're going to ask, first of all, why are you pursuing this opportunity? We always ask if there's any skeletons that you have in your closet. Malpractice history, license suspensions, or restriction. It's not going to be the second question, but it's likely going to be asked before you get off the phone. Always be completely honest about this. Be prepared. If you do have something you need to disclose, you don't need to go into it. I don't recommend that you go on and on about it, but you definitely need to have a couple of sentences and offer to send any documentation to support what you're saying, because this is where you can get screened out as well. It doesn't have to. There are people that have med-mal. I mean, if you look at neurosurgery and OBGYN, that's the two areas that really have a lot of med-mal. It's not going to screen you out. It's how you manage it that makes a difference. But always be honest and always offer to send in supporting documentation. Well, ask, when you'd be available to start. Any visa-related issues. The only legal question that somebody can ask you about your visa status is, are you eligible to work in the United States? Anybody ask you anything else other than that? They shouldn't be. That is the question. Are you eligible to work in the United States? But be prepared to answer that if you're not, where you are. Behavioral interviewing is being used more frequently. You really need to be prepared for that. So you're going to get some of these classic questions that I just described, but more than that, and I'll go into some of these questions a little bit later on. And in your handout, I've got some questions in there. So you can ask about the organizational structure, the partnership, the call, etc. Here's something that's really important. Why are you recruiting? You don't ask it like that, but you ask, is there a reason why this particular position is vacant? somebody retired, somebody left, et cetera. But it's a good idea for you to try and find out why. It kind of gives you a sense of what's going on. Who are the physicians? Where did they train, duration in the organization? You can't get all of this out of a phone interview. These are just some things that might be relevant to whatever practice you're looking at. You'll learn more if you go for a site visit. But I would, how many physicians do you have? What are their specialties, et cetera. And then talk a little bit about the community and lifestyle personal needs, because you've been prepared to do that through your self-assessment. Okay, salary should not, nobody knows what to do with salary these days because everybody tells you never to ask it, or you look kind of, greedy, and it's not supposed to be the first thing out of your mouth. But, we all live here. It's expensive. You got to know what it is. But it should never, ever be your first question. I can tell you, I don't care what the practice format is. I don't care if you even get 50% of what you bill. That's not what anybody wants to hear. So it should never be your first question. And you can ask later on at an appropriate time. And be prepared. This is really hard. A recruiter may ask, do you have a particular salary a range that you need in order to look at this position? Not too many people have an answer for that question, honestly, but you probably get asked. And if you are prepared, it's really helpful because we know, how much the jobs are going to pay, and we don't want to waste your time if, it's not something that is going to work for you. Ask for an information packet on the organization and community when you close out the phone call, and then ask them what the next step is. Okay? Then when you're done, decide if this is a job you consider accepting before you decide to interview. A lot of people just say, I'll just go in the interview and see what happens. It's very time consuming. Most people have a hard time getting time off. So really think through whether you want to go forward. There may be some, but this is really big. Pre-employment or pre-interview credentialing paperwork may be required. Turn it around as fast as you can. You'd be amazed at what people divine from whether people do paperwork or not. It's the most important, not the most important thing, but it shows your follow through and follow up and attention to detail. Okay. I'm not going to say too much about video interviews. People do them different ways. At Kaiser, we can't use Skype for our interviews. We have a huge firewall around our medical records, so it's not something that we can use. So we usually do group interviews for video, and we set them up actually through a company that we use to do so. So what's going to happen in that interaction is you're just going to probe a little bit deeper from the information that you learned in your telephone interview, get to know each other. The best video interviews, you'll meet your department chief and some other member of the department to get to know. And then you'll have an opportunity to ask a little bit more questions. Usually the first phone screen often is just the recruiter. So it's a wide range of questions that we just went through. Oftentimes when you do the video interview, basically with the video interview, it's usually more clinical. And so you would want to make sure if you do a video interview, which is kind of like the first site visit, that you have your clinical questions prepared. Site visit. Again, the first site visit, if you were to have one, is usually just the candidate. Again, here in Hawaii, we use video interviews for that. The site visit is usually the candidate and their family, usually their spouse or partner. Not everybody pays for children. Sometimes if you don't have someone to watch the children, a company will pay for that. But you should definitely bring your spouse or significant other. Don't bring them to the interviews. It surprised me over my career how many people bring a spouse to an interview, and honest to God, we don't know what to do with them. Some of them will just kind of sit, some of them will interact, and then it doesn't go well. Yeah, Kathleen? Yeah, not something to do. Definitely bring them to the site visit, but not to the interviews. Be prepared and read everything that was sent to you. Dress and behave professionally, wear business attire. Bring copies of your CV in case that person doesn't have them. Always be punctual, even if you have to be really early. As I mentioned to you earlier, the people that are in charge of healthcare organizations are a very, very different generation than many of our younger candidates, and they have certain things that they find very important, and one of them is being on time. And I've seen people from really extremely good candidates, and I've had the chief just not be able to get off he was 30 minutes late or 15 minutes late thing. So it's your impression. We don't know you very well. So your ability to do that is really important. Turn your cell phone off during the interview unless you're on call. We have had times when somebody has to come when they're on call. Just tell the interviewer, I'm really sorry, I need to put this down, but I'm on call. And let them know that. Otherwise, completely turn it off. we've had people sit and not say much. We don't know how to interpret that as recruiters. Ask questions and talk, because where people's head go with that is, they're not really interested in this job if they don't say too much. So really do ask questions and talk, because otherwise they just won't know what to make of it. Make eye contact, smile, firm handshake, positive, even if you've answered the question 5 times. And there's so many people that interview physicians, you probably will answer the same question more than 5 times. In your packet, I've given you some information about questions that you might be asked, and I've also given you questions that you could use to ask during the interviews, because sometimes people just don't know exactly what to ask. Most important thing, be yourself. Your goal is to have the interviewers judge you for who you are and accept you into the group on your own merits. The last thing that you want to do is to go to this interview and present yourself as somebody else, and then you get in the group and I'm like, gosh, this doesn't work. And everybody had different expectations. Behavior interview questions is very common, and these usually start out with something like, tell me about a time when you had a patient that didn't agree with your treatment plan. How did you handle that? Tell me about a time when your colleague had a treatment plan and you didn't agree with it. How did you handle that? You hear this over and over. Behavioral-based interviews are very, very common right now. And basically that's because the theory behind that is past history repeats itself and portends for the future. Describe for me is how these questions go. I won't go through them because you've got some in your packet. Give me an example of a specific situation where yada, yada, yada from there. Some people are very creative about their questions. I've heard some physicians actually ask what you want on your tombstone. I'm not really sure what that tells you. I've heard some other people ask who your favorite superhero character is. So some of these things are traditional, but people fit is the hardest thing for any organization to figure out with a candidate. So Southwest Airlines is probably the most creative of the questions that they ask their candidates, trying to get to fit. But you will get some kind of outrageous questions sometimes because people just really have a hard time trying to figure out if you're going to fit into their organization. When you respond to a behavioral-based question, describe a specific past situation, relay your behavior, and what was the outcome. The one thing you don't want to do is go rambling all over the place, because they're looking for the answer to the situation, but they're also looking to how you organize your thoughts. So that's really an important thing. So in this situation, this was the situation, this is what I did, and this is what the outcome was. And it's if you stick to that kind of format, it usually works quite well. But people, the downside of these questions is people tend to go off, and it's hard to come back. And people think, they're a disorganized thinker, they're not logical, etc. It's amazing what people can read into that. Okay, what are we looking for when you get done? How are we going to look at the site visit? We're going to look at communication. We're going to try and figure out the candidate's compatibility, pardon the typo, with the position, the maturity, adaptability, motivation, strong work orientation, organization and prioritization, common sense, and judgment. Those are really hard things to figure out. Really fit is the hardest thing for you to figure out, and fit is really the hardest thing for recruiters to figure out. So that's why this process is so lengthy. You have a cover letter, you have a CV, you have a screening phone call, you have a video interview, and a site visit. And all of those activities are meant to have you get to know the organization better and for us to get to know you better. It's actually quite a lengthy process. Your prospective employer should pay for travel, lodging, and sometimes meal expenses. When you're going somewhere in a site visit, always make sure you find out what they're going to cover, because not everybody covers the same things, and that could get kind of expensive if you get caught unawares. Make sure your significant other's expenses are covered. A dinner or an evening event is very important, and you expect your significant other to be there as well. This is big. It's meant to be social. It's meant to get to know each other. I highly recommend that you don't drink too much, if you drink at all. We've had some pretty entertaining site visit dinners with people that have had a little more alcohol than they probably should have, but that could completely ruin your chances in getting employed. So I tell people, don't drink at all. Have it when you go home. No, just joking. But that's something. Some people don't think about it because they're so nervous. They think, well, I'll just have a glass of wine or a couple of beers, and sometimes that's not a good idea. Tour the area with a realtor. If somebody doesn't offer that to you, ask them for it, not to sell you anything, but to show you the community, and visit schools and daycare. After the interview is over, send thank you notes to all the people, or even an email. Thank you notes better, but an email is good too, and let them know what your experience has been. Follow up any questions that you might have. If somebody asks you for more information, respond quickly. And you know what? After all said and done, and you've gone through this entire process, if it's not for you, say so. Just let them know, I really had a good experience with you, but having thought through all of this, this is just not a good fit for me. And you don't need to explain in great detail. Or my family and I have decided that we're not ready to move at this time. There's all kinds of things that you can do to graciously say, I'm not interested. I highly recommend that you do it graciously, because you just never know, maybe 2 years down the pike, where this might, in a different stage of your life, look like a good opportunity to you. So if you back out, always thank folks. You can tell how much effort we would put into this. So some people are actually kind of embarrassed by the time they get done and say, oh my God, I got to say no. But you do need to be forthright, and we really appreciate it when you do that, but do it very graciously and gracefully. And if you are interested, then you need to go back to your list that we talked about earlier about the things that are important to you. So when you start to negotiate, you're good to go. And then you're prepared. And then at this point, you go back to that list that says, okay, this is what I must have, this is what's nice to have, and this is intolerable for me in the practice. So you've got to have those close by when you go to negotiate your contract. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? That's a lot of information going at 2:40 here, but I think our time is, am I good? Okay, yes. That's a very good question, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it's something that you should ask. It differs. Most places, people use different titles, but most places the medical director or department chief is the person that makes the final decision. I have to tell you, at Kaiser, our board of directors makes all of our final hiring decisions. But in general, they take the recommendation of the department chief or the medical director. Kathleen, what is your experience in that? Yeah. Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because you should ask that to know who's going to make the decision about my hire, and make sure that you meet with them. I've heard from some candidates that didn't get to meet with the key people that are the key decision makers, and that's a real problem. So it is something that you should know. But there is a variation. It usually is the CMO in some instances, the medical director, chief of the department. If it's an academic position, you have a search committee. The search committee is usually a screening body. In some places, they can vote and they make the decision. In other places, the chair has that decision. But there really is a wide variation in that. Any other questions? Yes. I'll ask Kathleen to answer this too. Honestly, a good recruiter should bring it up because it is such a big issue. But if they don't, and you find yourself in that situation, I think you need to bring it up yourself and say, because we can be discriminated against if we bring it up. You should be able to ask that question. The thing that can get out of balance and be issues for some recruiters is if that's the only thing that you bring up, or if you keep bringing it up over and over and over again, and not be or seem to be as engaged in looking at the position. But what I would do is at the end of the screening phone call, if everything that you've heard is looking good to you, I would say, what are the next steps, et cetera. And then I would bring it up and say, I'm really looking forward. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm going to go back and discuss this with my family. And then if you would want to say a couple of words at that point, I'm making this up, but, my wife is a freelance photographer, and I've got 2 children in this grade and that grade. At that point, if the person's interested in you, they should pick up that ball and go with it. But I would always bring that up. I wouldn't bring it up right in the beginning, but it needs to be discussed in that first site visit and engaged. And if you have specific questions, and particularly if you do have a spouse that has perhaps a career that is going to be challenging, I bring it up, because you should be able to do that. The thing about you as a candidate is that you don't want the person to get the impression that that's everything. That, in other words, if you don't spend enough time asking about the position, et cetera, it could look like, you're interested in the family, you're interested in the relocation, but you're not that interested in the position. But you should be able to bring that up, and you should. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Kathleen? I would actually be surprised if somebody doesn't bring that up, because the other question in tandem with what Kathleen is, one of the things that our recruiters will ask, is there anybody else in your family that's going to need assistance with employment? And then that, just kind of engages. Most people, it's hard. The education and the age that you relocate your child is really significant. So most people will bring that up. It's hard to move kids at different ages. So I'll be surprised if they don't bring it up, but if they don't, you should definitely bring that up in discussion, particularly if you don't know that much about the area. Here, everybody has the impression that all your kids have to go to private school, and it costs $1 million and that kind of thing. And so it's our job to have a really good discussion with people about all the options that there are for education here. But it really needs to be discussed, because that's really, really important. Anything to add to that, Kathleen? Any other questions? Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. If anybody wants a copy of the PowerPoint, just let me know, and I'll be happy to send it off to you through the AHEC group. Yes? Which one? I have a few more of those too. Anybody get a copy of the CD format? On behalf of the Hawaii Physician Recruiters Group, it's been a pleasure talking with you this morning. It is all of the physician recruiters in the state. We get together, we meet once a month, and we work together on doing everything that we can to bring the best providers to Hawaii. We do compete together with each other to some degree, but we also band together to try to work together to assist the physicians in the community. So if there's anything that I can do for you, or if I can get you to one of the other recruiters, I'm really happy to do that. Thank you.